I used to exercise intensely in the morning, and then I would go to my corporate gig and I would sit down for 8, 9, 10 hours per day, and I would wonder why I wasn't seeing that much metabolic improvement. It's interesting because we are told that as long as we get 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week, we're considered healthy. Alternatively, you can do 75 minutes of vigorous activity per week and be considered healthy. Well, what if research is starting to illuminate that being sedentary literally erases the benefits of your hard work and exercise? Now, I'm not trying to discourage you, because don't worry, there's very, very, very good news alongside this. Now, first we have to look at a study that helps us understand being sedentary. Okay, so it took a look at people that are sedentary less than 4 hours per day and compared them to subjects that sat down between 4 and 8 hours. Subjects that sat down between 4 and 8 hours only had like a 2% increase risk of dying. Subjects that were sedentary between 8 and 11 hours per day had a 15% increased risk of all-cause mortality, and subjects that sat down longer than 11 hours per day, well, they had a 45% increase in all-cause mortality. So we know sitting down more is not good, but what if you're exercising and then sitting down? What if you are meeting your 150 minutes of physical activity per week? Now, here's what's interesting though. 75% of the United States does not even meet that 150 minutes to begin with. So we need to unpack this quite a bit. And after today's video, a big thank you to Create and a 50% off discount link for Creatine Gummies. These are Creatine Gummies that are sweetened with allulose, so you're not getting a bunch of sugar like you usually do with a lot of gummies. And these things are dosed appropriately at 1.5 grams of creatine per gummy. So you can take small little doses, or you can increase the dose as much as you want, because creatine is really quite effective and considered very safe. And when it comes down to the world of longevity, which is the topic that we're talking about, creatine has some pretty solid evidence when it comes down to maintaining muscle mass, when it comes down to potential neuroinflammation. It's honestly one of the least expensive and most effective supplements, in my opinion, for longevity. Not to mention, a 50% off discount link is pretty awesome. So a big thank you to Create, and that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video. So this is where an interesting study that was published in the journal Lancet comes out. Okay, this was a meta-analysis looking at 13 studies with over 1 million people. Okay, very big study. And if you look at the figure that's on the screen, it illustrates it. So basically they divided people into 4 groups, and they used what are called metabolic equivalent hours. This is a fancy way of saying like the most active quartile and the least active quartile. Okay, then within those fourths, they divided them into groups that were sitting down the most. Okay, so if the image is still on the screen, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So you can see in the quartile that are very, very, very active, if they are sitting down for 8+ hours per day, they still have a 5% increase risk of dying. So what that tells us there is that even in the super athletic group, sitting down still offsets the exercise a little bit. But what we have to pay most attention to is the moderate activity group, like the 16 metabolic equivalent hours. So this is where you would still be meeting the 150 minutes of exercise per week minimum requirement. Okay, so you're still meeting that, but in this case, if you're sitting down for 8 hours or more per day, you have a 25% increased risk of dying. What am I saying with this? What this means, we need to stop looking at our total minutes of exercise, and we need to be paying attention to our total minutes of being sedentary. Being less sedentary is more important than exercise if you really look at the data. So when you're looking at the main basic amount of exercise we're supposed to get, if you do that and then you sit down for 8 hours per day, you're essentially offsetting that. Now, there's another figure now that you'll see on the screen, and this demonstrates that if this is TV viewing time as a subcategory, it increases all-cause mortality even more. Probably has to do with the fact that when you're sitting down and watching TV, you're also probably eating, you're probably bombarded with blue light, there's a bunch of other different things. Okay, don't get me wrong here though. Okay, obviously exercise has huge benefits. Huge benefits when it comes down to cardiovascular disease risk. Huge benefits when it comes down to insulin resistance. Huge benefits when it comes down to glucose management. And up until recently, we saw pretty big improvements in plasma triglyceride levels. But now we see some interesting evidence that suggests that, well, once again, sitting down might be erasing those benefits. from your exercise. Now I'm a nutrition guy, so I'm gonna make a note here that I think is very important. I don't think these studies necessarily consider that people are being sedentary and then consuming a bunch of carbohydrates. That can certainly impact things, right? That can elevate serum triglycerides, that can elevate all kinds of things. So even if people are active in the morning, and maybe they consume some carbohydrates surrounding their workout in the morning, and then they're sedentary for 10 hours the rest of the day, and they're eating carbs like crazy because they figure, oh, I worked out, it's fine, I'm gonna burn them. That's not always the case, because if you're sedentary, that is in the literal moment, and that is not necessarily going to equate to a license to eat a bunch of carbohydrates when you know you're not going to be moving. The carbohydrates should be allocated surrounding the time that you're active, and when you're sedentary, you might want to modulate that a little bit unless you're an athlete, right? So for most people, I think it matters. So I think it's really important to have like lower carb, like high protein snacks on hand, things like that. So being resistant to exercise. Here we have a study that was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology. This is fascinating because this might erase some of what we learned 50 years ago. So what they did is they took subjects and they instructed them to sit down 13 hours per day for 4 days out of a week, okay? And on those 4 days, they were only allowed to walk 4,000 steps, okay? And then they divided into two arms. So the first arm, they had them do no exercise along with that protocol, no exercise whatsoever. The second arm, they had them do that exact same thing, okay? So no more than 4,000 steps, sitting 13 hours a day, except they had them do 1 hour of 65% VO2 max exercise on a treadmill first thing in the morning, okay? What they found is that there was no difference between the two groups in terms of plasma triglycerides and metabolic benefit. So what that tells us is that the exercise did not matter when people were sedentary for that long. That scares the heck out of me because yes, I want you to exercise, I want you to be jacked, I want you to be tan, I want you to be doing all these things, but it doesn't really matter if you're sedentary all the time. It's better for you to just be moving throughout the day than it is to like bust your butt doing a bunch of exercise, torturing yourself, and then sitting down for 13 hours. But people poked holes in this study, okay? They said things like, well, if they're sedentary, it means that they're probably just eating more than they're burning because they're sedentary. So it's really a calorie thing. And that's a viable like consideration and a hole to poke. So there was another study. This one was published in the American Journal of Physiology. Very, very similar design, except in this case, they controlled calories. One arm ended up having calories matched for their activity. So they were at baseline calories. And another group ended up having a surplus while they were sedentary. Guess what? Exercise failed to induce benefits in either group. Why? Because it did not matter how many calories they were consuming. All that mattered was that they were sedentary. And I know this is scary because it really just kind of takes the wind out of your sail thinking all this exercise I'm doing is for nothing. No, exercise does things. It makes you look good, it builds muscle, which is a glucose sink, it's important. But moving around throughout the day is even more important. Now, what is happening mechanistically that we need to understand here? Well, it comes down to triglycerides being mobilized, okay? So when you exercise, you mobilize fats, okay? But you need these triglycerides to ultimately get taken up by the muscle. And these triglycerides, when they get taken up by the muscle, they require an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. So if you were to work out, and then you were to be active the rest of the day, that would stimulate lipoprotein lipase to break down triglycerides into a usable free fatty acid form, okay? Now, that means that you're gonna burn those free fatty acids. So not only do you lose weight, but you also get the metabolic benefit of lowering your plasma triglycerides. Well, here's what's wild. There was a study published in FASEB journal that demonstrated that if you are inactive, your levels of lipoprotein lipase can fall 90+%. So what does that mean? That means if you exercise and you mobilize a bunch of triglycerides and do a bunch of good work, and then you sit on your bum all day, guess what happens? Well, you don't have as much of the enzyme breaking down those fats that you've mobilized. So they just go right back in. They just go right back into circulation. They don't get broken down and taken up by the muscle. And that could be a large contributing factor to why we do not see triglycerides coming down as much in the serum in people that exercise and then sit down all day. So what's the good news? What's the silver lining? Well, a lot of different bodies of research have kind of come together and ultimately find the common denominator to be about 8,500 steps per day being the magic number. Now, that's not in one sitting, that's throughout the course of the day, right? The good news with this is really good news, is that you don't need to have this torturous, like 1 hour training session in the morning. You can do your resistance training in 15, 20 minutes, do something, just get muscle load, and then walk around throughout the rest of the day. Get up, have a stand-up desk, try to watch your clocks, watch your iWatches, watch those things and get 8,500 steps throughout the course of the day, with the resistance training just being a small amount in the morning, and you are literally going to be better off than people that are sweating their off on an elliptical for an hour and a half and then sitting down all day. Trust me, the data is here, and 1 million people in a meta-analysis does not lie. I'll see you tomorrow.